The White Snake. This is a very strange little folk tale that has a very interesting little secret in it. So, this story that you can find in Grimm's collection of folk tales is classified as ATU type 673, called the White Serpent's Flesh. And you can combine that with 554, which is called the Grateful Animals. These two are often combined together like this, as the one that you see in Grimm's. So, here's the story. Contrary to a warning, a servant or a cook eats the flesh of a white snake, often from the king's pot, which grants him the power to understand animals. Another version of this is a boy or a driver tastes the meat of a white snake that has been prepared by a healer or a farmer, which grants the power to understand grass and trees. Is another version of this. When he is accused of stealing a ring, often it's the queen's ring, his knowledge nevertheless enables him to prove his innocence. He overhears ducks talking about how one of them swallowed the queen's ring, or in which case he kills the duck and gets the ring out of it, or he learns that the ring is in the stomach of a grateful fish. Then you move on to the grateful animals part of this story. This is often a single episode in other stories. In this story, the traveler meets three animals, one from the air, like a bird, one from the water, like a fish, or one from the earth, like ants or worms or something. And in each case, they're in trouble, and he rescues them. After this, he falls in love with a princess whose father, or the princess herself, sets him three impossible tasks to accomplish. Through their gratitude, the animals help him, and he wins their hand. There's variants of this story all over the world. We find them in many, many different places in Europe, Russia, in the Middle East, Mongolia, India, Korea, Indonesia, Japan, the Americans, all over Africa, the Americas, I should say, and all over Africa. So this is clearly a story that we have the potential to tell in pretty much any setting, and so therefore qualifies as archetypal. But what is this story really about? Unlike the other ones that we've discussed so far, this one doesn't start with a species typical problem like parental abandonment that you see in Hansel and Gretel, or female intersex competition like you see in Snow White. Instead, we have this strange image of a white snake hidden in the king's feasting hall that, should you acquire it, gives you the ability to speak to animals or plants, which, in combination, not only allows you to escape being put to death for being a thief, but then it allows you to win the heart of the princess and become a prince by marrying her after accomplishing these tasks. So this one is actually very alchemical. Now, what do I mean by that? Now, if you're not familiar with Jungian psychology, then you may not understand what that's talking about. Alchemy, as applied to psychology, is a particular style of approaching the unconscious or the spontaneous thoughts that emerge in our minds that are not directed by us. So a classic example of that would be dreams. We don't sit down and create dreams, but they happen to us. And analyzing them helps us to gain insight into inner conflicts, neurosis, whatever. So active imagination is like doing this only in real time with therapists, where you learn to quiet your mind and allow images to emerge. And when you do this, if you do this long enough, you will actually find yourself in situations very similar to dream analysis. And in fact, often you'll encounter stories that match a lot of the alchemical narratives, which is something that Jung noticed in his studies, and others afterward have noticed this as well. And of course, I have too. This fairy tale then is very much about the secret to psychological integration. It's a story in deeply symbolic images of how to live one's life in such a way as to achieve peace, inner harmony, and maximum mastery over yourself. And I believe, because it's so widespread, that it is another one of these scripts that we all have the potential to experience, and it's just kind of hidden on the genome, right there waiting. Okay, so what are some examples of this? In some of the clinical work, I've seen patients talk about dreams of snakes biting, white snakes, snakes circling the body. These are people who haven't read any of these stories at all. The caduceus, there's a whole slew of these. And the long story short is that snakes tend to be symbols that emerge during times of a need for psychological transformation or ego transformation. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean times where the ego really needs to encounter the stuff that's going on underneath the surface. They need to look inwardly. They need to deal with their neurosis. They need to deal with their inner conflicts. And when this happens, you see images of snakes in their dreams or in their active imagination. Well, why would that be? Well, it seems as though what's going on is that the psyche uses the image of a snake to give us a picture of our instinctive elements in the mind. And it just so happens that a snake is really kind of like a proto-animal in a naive sense, right? Well, we know that snakes are actually very advanced in terms of reptiles, but you got to look at this just from the point of view of a psyche trying to make images. And it's going to use a snake because it just embodies animalness or instinctiveness in a way that's very powerful. And this is why snakes get used so many times in religious symbolism. And dragons are like the most fundamental animal in many different mythologies, particularly indigenous ones. So again, I've seen this over and over and over in clinical material, and people have never exposure to this kind of thing. Soldiers, I remember we did a paper a while back on the dreams of soldiers in combat zones, and they will have dreams of animals when they're really struggling with their own instincts, when they're struggling with powerful affects that they don't know how to integrate. And the psyche will dream that they're in this situation where these animals are engaging with them and they don't know what to do, which reflects their conscious situation. So in the folktale, it tells us that we have to find this white snake and ingest it. Now that's something very kind of unusual. What is that all about? Well, that is about the merging of the two sides of what's encountering here. In other words, the ego and the self, or the ego and the unconscious. The self is symbolized by the white snake in this situation. We know it's the self because it's a secret within the kingdom. It's jealously guarded by the king. It's very hard to find, and it grants you these very powerful abilities. And in this instance, the ability to talk to animals or plants. But what is that? So then, if we look at the idea that animals are pictures of our own instinctive forces, then the ability to talk to them means that the ego can actually integrate with them more effectively. This is what we do in psychotherapy. It's really interesting that we have a folktale that's basically giving us a picture, again, in symbols of what often happens in effective therapy. We gain the ability to speak to our instinctive elements, that our fears, our anger, our desires that are driving us up the wall, our inner conflicts. The way that we integrate these things is we have to, number one, we have to acknowledge that they exist, right? We can't be neurotic. We have to acknowledge that they're there, and then we have to talk to them, essentially. And what the story is telling us is that the only way to do that is to engage with the self, right? The snake. Now, it doesn't tell you how to do that, like in a literal sense, because folktales don't have that much information in them. They give you the general guidelines, and then you've got to figure out the details. And a lot of times, that it's a roadmap. All right, that's how instincts work, right? That's exactly what this is. This is a complex narrative that is instinctive in itself. Okay, so now in the story, the ability to talk to animals allows the hero to avoid being put to death for stealing the queen's ring. This is a symbol of love found in all kinds of different tales and stories. And itself also a symbol of the self as well, due to its circular nature and the balance that you see, the symmetry of it. The point being here is that one of the first things that happens is that you don't get destroyed by this process. Whereas, and that's an important lesson in therapy. Again, it parallels therapy in a way that's just really wild. Like, how does that work? And now I understand that you can argue that, well, maybe I'm just reading into it, and that's a possibility. But honestly, I don't believe that that's what's going on. I think that it's just a reflection of our own inner healing at work here, giving us the roadmap to success. So then what happens is the protagonist of this story goes on 3 tasks. They cover talking to animals from land, sea, and sky, or plants in that version. So land, sea, and sky, well, that covers pretty much everything there is. So it's very comprehensive. It means that you have to do the work. You have to engage with this process at all levels. at land, which would be like the body, the sea, which would be like elements of feeling, and the sky, which would be thought. Everything. You've got to be able to handle this. Now, in each case, he helps the animals that are there. He gets them out of trouble. He helps save them from being destroyed or what have you. And that pays off later. But notice here that the key to this is saying communication skills are how you achieve victory. It's not strength of arms or prowess or any of that stuff. Those things are great, but this is not about that. This is more spiritual. This is more psychological and in nature. So it's saying knowledge of the self, knowledge of the natural world that lives within you and also outside of the psyche, or being the ability to engage with this great zoo of consciousness within the non-ego mind allows you to achieve victory and harmony within the kingdom, meaning not only the inner world, but also the outer world in which you live. So adjustment and integration are possible through this process, so says this folktale. And what is the reward? Well, the reward is the princess, right? The highest value that there is, which is ongoing life itself. That's one of the most fundamental drives that exist in all animals. Live, procreate, make it to the next generation somehow, right? That's the goal. And it says this is how you achieve this. Whether you want to look at that as, say, an image of immortality, like if you want to get really spiritual with it, you can. But the two are not incommensurable, right? There's not mutually exclusive. Ongoing life in the physical sense, but also spiritual value. So the white snake is a really interesting, a very kind of strange little folk tale that I just read to my grandchildren the other day. And I thought, this is a great one. I need to talk about this one on the channel. It's easy to overlook this one because it's not as well known. It's kind of whimsical and weird. But it has these really profound messages hidden within it that can really resonate with the listeners. I think children love hearing them just because of the whimsy, but I think there's a little bit of recognition, too, of the process at work. And adults, of course, can listen to this and go, I wonder, that's really interesting. Those symbols are in there, So any case, if you did enjoy this, then don't forget to like and subscribe and sign up for my newsletter as well. And I will see you next time.